Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here. This is my first time speaking in Idaho. And I love your potatoes. I'm Scottish. We really like potatoes. Just make sure, oh great, my screen is up, wonderful. Well, I want to begin with a quote from one of the people in history who I look up to a lot, whose life I try to emulate when it comes to responding to injustice based on how he responded to injustice. And that individual is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And one of, I think, his most powerful quotes is a largely unknown quote. And he said the following: "Whom you would change, you must first love, and they must know that you love them." When I reflect on those words, I think really that is what's at the heart of our pro-life message. It's love, that we will the others good. And we know abortion is not good for preborn children, and because we will their good, we are becoming their voices and taking their message to the public square to draw people's attention to their plight so that they will embrace these little lives rather than end those little lives. But as much as we love preborn children and will their good, we also will the good of the born. And we know that abortion is not in the interests of born individuals either. And if we wish to win those individuals to the pro-life cause, then they must know that we love them as much as we love preborn children. Which is why I also like to say that the good arguments we give to the culture must be communicated by good arguers. Whom you would change, you must first love. And they must know that you love them. And so this evening, what I want to do is focus on 3 areas in particular, where if we can really grow and develop in those 3 areas, then I think we will succeed in loving the preborn as well as the born, so as to change our culture and make it a pro-life culture. And the 3 things in particular I want to discuss tonight are the following. The first thing I want to talk about is the importance of faith being the foundation from which our action springs, and how we have to stay connected to God and rely on His inspirations to flow through our activity. The second thing I want to talk about is how we can sharpen our minds, which will lead to the third point, which is how important it is that we also soften our hearts. So a foundation of faith, of prayer, sharpening our minds, and softening our hearts. When it comes to that foundation of faith, in John chapter 15, verses 4 to 5, we're told, "Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Those are very strong words. We can't take that lightly. It's not apart from me, you can do a little bit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. When I train people how to dialogue with others on the topic of abortion, how to be winsome and persuasive, I often tell a lot of stories that have come from personal encounters I've had with the culture, and tonight I'll be doing that. And people will often marvel and say, "How do you come up with those analogies, or what made you say that?" And the answer is, I abide in God. I stay connected to the vine, the branch connected to the source of strength and inspiration and insight. Mother Teresa once said, "I am just a little pencil in the hand of a writing God, sending a love letter to the world." We are merely that instrument, that tool that is being used by God, but we have to stay connected to Him. And that's why I'll be forever indebted to one of my previous spiritual directors who encouraged me to read a book called The Soul of the Apostolate. In other words, the heart of ministry work, the soul of the apostolate. And in this book, it talks about how when people are involved in apostolic or ministry-based activity, there is a tendency to focus on a passage in the scriptures that we're all very likely familiar with. The harvest is plentiful, but what? The laborers are few. But you know what happens when we focus on on that passage, we come up with a new ending. You see, we often think it finishes with, therefore, get out into the harvest and do all the other work that the other people aren't around to do. That's not what the scriptures say. After telling us the harvest is plentiful but the laborers are few, the scriptures tell us to pray that the Lord of the harvest will send more people into the harvest. We are called to do what God is calling us to do. And we are not to become so busy that we take on the work of other people and use it as an excuse to stop praying or cut back on our prayers and move ourselves a little further away from the vine. We have a responsibility to stay connected to God, through that follow his divine inspirations, but where other people ought to do the same, we are not to fill their shoes. They need to see the void so that they realize they are called to fill the void. But they will never fill the void if we take it upon ourselves to do that and become busy, doing, acting, that we stop praying. And in this book, the author says, if that happens, you become a threat to the very ministry-based activity you are doing. You become a danger to it. And so he warns the reader to make their activity spring from a foundation of prayer. And there's a beautiful image given in this book referencing an idea by St. Bernard, who once said, we are to be reservoirs, not channels. We're to be reservoirs, not channels. Now, if you think about those two bodies of water, they're very different. A channel, the water just flows through. And he said that's like the busy soul going about the apostolic activity, the ministry work, never taking time to slow down, to be still, and know that God is God. We're not to be like the channel. We're to be the reservoir. How is a reservoir different from a channel? Well, a reservoir fills up and the excess overflows. And that is what we are to be like. Taking that first foundational step of allowing ourselves to be filled up by the Holy Spirit and his divine inspirations, the source of love itself, and letting that flow over into each and every encounter we have with the image bearers in our midst. Once we do that, then we're ready to move to the second point I want to speak about this evening, which is sharpening our minds. Once we know that we are called to go out, to be salt, to be light, how do we do that in a way which is winsome? In a way which, like a magnet, draws people in to this truth that we know will set them free. Well, if we want to know how to be like that, we need to look at examples of others who have been like that. And the greatest example we can look to of someone who managed to magnetically draw people in and captivate them is Jesus Christ. And in the scriptures, we see Jesus illustrating for us how we can best interact with others so as to lead them to a truth that will set them free. There are many examples that Jesus gives for us, but there are two in particular that I want to highlight this evening. The first is referenced or illustrated in the 10th chapter of Luke. In the 10th chapter of Luke, a lawyer, a scholar of the law, comes up to Jesus and says to him, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, Jesus knew the answer to that question. He created the answer to that question. And what an opportunity it was to get up on a soapbox and preach it at that lawyer. But Jesus doesn't do that. The scriptures say that when he was asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" he looked at that scholar of the law, he looked at that lawyer, and he said, "What does the law say?" He asked a question of him because in his infinite wisdom, that the law that he created, he also wrote on that man's heart. And he knew that man had studied it. And so by asking a question of the man, Jesus was going to draw that truth out instead of trying to force it in. And that strategy of asking questions was something Jesus had done much earlier, well before his public ministry. I was reflecting on the book of Luke one day, and I was reading about how when Jesus, at the age of 12, was lost in the temple, and Joseph and Mary were searching for him, trying to find him. They came upon him in the temple, and the scriptures say that he was surrounded by a crowd, and he was listening and asking questions. The 12-year-old Christ child already demonstrating for us how to engage others, how to draw them in, ask them questions, and the scriptures then say all were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So if we want to engage the culture so as to draw them in, we want to be like Christ and ask good questions to draw truth out. Not only did Jesus ask questions when interacting with people, but he also told stories. The scriptures are filled with him speaking in parables. And if we go back to that encounter in the 10th chapter of Luke, when the lawyer first answers Jesus' question, he says, love. Love the Lord your God with your heart, with your mind, with your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And at that point, all Jesus has to do is affirm and confirm what he said. You're right. Do that, and you will live. And then the scriptures say, back there. The scriptures say that the lawyer wanted to justify himself, and so he prods Jesus a little further and says, well, who is my neighbor? And it's at that point where Jesus switches gears from asking questions to telling a parable. And he talks about a man going down the road to Jericho and robbers coming upon him and beating him and robbing him and leaving him half dead. And this was a powerful way to communicate to that crowd because everyone listening knew about the road to Jericho. They knew how dangerous it was. In the time of Jesus, the road to Jericho was known as the Bloody Pass. It was a winding, meandering road, very conducive to ambushing. And so Jesus is immediately stimulating the imagination. Everyone can visualize the risk that there is to travelers along that road. And so he's drawing them in with a setting they can relate to. He draws them in with characters they can relate to. A priest, a Levite, a Samaritan. And it's in that setting that everyone is baited to listen in about and visualize in their own mind that Jesus brings to life what it means to love God and love neighbor. Questions and stories are two very powerful ways to engage the culture. And so as we look at how to sharpen our minds so as to win the minds of those we encounter, we want to think about how we can take all that we know about why abortion is wrong and communicate it to others by asking questions and telling stories. And so I want to give you some examples of how I have applied this in the encounters that I have had. A few years ago, I was at a college campus in Florida, and a student came up to me, and she must know about the power of questions. Of course, in college campuses, they don't focus on Jesus applying this tactic so much as Socrates, so it's called the Socratic approach of asking questions. And she, I guess, knew about the power of questions, and so she comes up to me. I'm at a pro-life exhibit. I'm debating with students who are walking past, and she quite smugly says, I have a question for you. Do you mind if I ask? And I said, sure, go ahead. And she said, do you sit under acorns for shade? And I knew where she was going with this, but I didn't let on. And I said, no, I don't. And she said, exactly. And just as an acorn isn't an oak tree, a fetus isn't a human. And so I said, well, that's a very interesting point. You know, if you don't want to really affirm what they've said, but you don't want to come on too strong, sorry, that's a bad analogy, then interesting is kind of a neutral word. So I said, you know, that's an interesting point. I said, do you mind if I ask you a question? And she said, go ahead. And I said, would you ever give the keys of your car to a 5-year-old child and tell the child to go for a drive? And she said, well, no, of course not, but what's your point? And I said, okay, well, first of all, trying to find some common ground, I said, I agree with you. I wouldn't give the keys of my car to a 5-year-old child either. And here's what I think this says about us. What I think it says is that we both recognize that there are some things that only adults or mature members of a species should be given the rights to do, because they're the only ones that can actually do it. And because a 5-year-old can't drive a car safely, we're not going to give the keys of our car to a 5-year-old. We recognize that that's an activity or a behavior that adults can do, but children can't. Would you acknowledge that the 5-year-old is still a human being? She said, yes. And I said, okay, let's go back to your original point about the acorn not being able to provide shade. I said, you're right. The acorn can't provide shade the way the 5-year-old can't drive a car. In other words, the acorn is a very immature oak. It's not yet the adult of its species and cannot do what the adult of its species can do, the way the 5-year-old cannot do what the adult of her species can do. I said the acorn comes to be after fertilization, after the male flower has released pollen that finds the female flower. After fertilization, then you have the acorn. So the acorn is of the oak family, but just not the adult version. And so I said, in the same way, the 5-year-old is of the human family, but just not the adult version. And the same can be said for the embryo or the fetus. If they have human parents, they're also of the human family, but they're not the adult version. So I said, if we were to really analogize what you've said, or do a parallelism with what you've said, we'd have to say, just as an acorn isn't an oak tree, a fetus isn't an adult. Just as an acorn isn't an oak tree, a 5-year-old isn't an adult. But just as the acorn is of the oak family, the 5-year-old and the fetus are of the human family. They just haven't completed their development. Or to give you another example, I was on a Canadian campus, again, at a pro-life exhibit, debating with students, and a student walked past, and I said, what do you think about abortion? He said, I'm pro-choice. I asked a question back. I said, why? He said, well, the fetus isn't alive yet. And I looked at him and asked a question. If the fetus isn't alive, why do you need to do an abortion? And he looked at me. I could tell right away he was a philosophy student. They just had a look. And he starts stroking the long straggly beard that he had. He goes, you're good. He said, I'm going to talk to you. He said, most people are quite dumb. But I suppose you're worth my attention. So I'm going to talk to you. And so we ended up having a conversation for 30 minutes. My point is, it all came as a result of a question. A cool question that showed a problem with his way of thinking. Drawing truth out instead of pushing truth in. Or to give you another example, I gave a talk once, an obstetrician gynecologist came up to me and said, with you talking about the importance of questions, I want to tell you about a fascinating encounter I had with a patient and the power of questions that encounter taught me. He said, I have a patient who tragically has had multiple miscarriages, and this has caused her a great deal amount of pain and turmoil and trauma. And he said, I have to say though, I was surprised when she recently got pregnant again. When she came to me, she said she wanted to have an abortion. And he said, I thought for a moment that it's possible she doesn't want all the trauma and sadness and grief from another miscarriage, so she's trying to deal with that before that would happen again. He said, so I asked her a question. I said to her, what impact did having the miscarriages have on you? And so she kind of described everything, the depression, the lack of sleep, the loss of appetite, how much she felt she couldn't even function. She was kind of reliving all of those emotions as she was answering his question. When she was done, he said, what impact do you think an abortion will have on you? And she just looked at him and said, I never thought of it that way. The power of a question. It gives us permission to explore our emotions, our thoughts, our senses, our feelings, that leads us to what we know deep down we ought to do. I was recently meeting with a couple pregnancy center directors back in Canada, and I was talking to them about the importance of questions, but the kinds of questions we ought to ask and the kinds of questions we shouldn't ask. And one of the questions I'll often hear pro-lifers ask the public in conversation on abortion is the following. A common pro-life question is to, at some point in a debate, say to someone, well, what if your mother had aborted you? And I looked at these pregnancy center directors and I said, I recommend against asking that question. And I said, here's why I recommend against asking that question. Because all too often, the answer I've heard is, I wouldn't care, I wouldn't know, or I wish my mother had. And I said, some people's sense of self-worth is so low that asking that question does not help us lead them to the right answer, because it leads them to the answer of wanting to eliminate themselves when we're trying to lead them to an answer where they want to embrace that life. So I said, obviously it's a problem when someone's sense of self-worth is that low, and we need to deal with it. But in terms of specifically trying to get the person to think, I shouldn't end an individual's life, what we want to do is ask a question that has them think about someone they do love, in case they don't love themselves. And so I said, I'll often ask someone to think for a moment about someone they really love. I said, is there an individual, whether it's a family member, a friend, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, someone that you really love? And then when they say yes, and they even tell me perhaps who that individual is, then I say, what if someone aborted them? And that's the game changer. Because they're now thinking about the absence of that life in the presence of an object of love, someone they care about. And within a couple days of me speaking with these pregnancy center directors, I got an email from one of them, and she said, an abortion-minded client called our center, and over the course of the phone call, in telling us that she was pregnant and wanting an abortion, she shared that she worked at a daycare. And remembering what you had just told us, the counselor said to her, think about those children at the daycare. How would you feel if one of those children was missing from your life as a result of abortion? And a couple days later, that girl called back, said she decided not to go ahead with the abortion. And when the counselor asked her what it was that caused her to reconsider, she said, it was that question you asked me about the kids that I take care of in the daycare. The power of questions. Or to give you another example where I incorporated questions amidst a story, I was at a high school debating with teenagers about abortion, and at one point in a conversation with one girl in particular, she said to me with some exasperation, look, if you have a baby in one hand and a fetus in the other hand, you obviously pick the baby. And before responding, I thought for a moment about babies versus fetuses. And I thought about how any one of us in this room right now could take care of a baby. But when it comes to fetuses, only one person can take care of a fetus, and that's the individual whose body the fetus is in. And so in a sense, we could say that fetuses are weaker and more vulnerable by virtue of that higher degree of dependency. And babies are a little stronger and more independent compared to the fetus, because anyone can care for them, and they could even be left alone in a room for a nap and they'd be okay. You can't leave a fetus alone. So I thought what this girl actually said to me, but she didn't communicate it verbally, but what she'd actually said was, if you have a stronger person in one hand and a weaker person in the other hand, you obviously pick the stronger person. And the moment I had essentially translated in my own mind what she had said to that statement, I realized in that moment she doesn't mean what she says. Because civil societies always prioritize weaker people ahead of stronger people. That's why when a ship is sinking, it's women and children first. That's why in a parking lot, handicapped parking spots are closer to the door. We prioritize the weaker ahead of the stronger. But I knew if I just said that, that would be pushing info in. And I knew instead I needed to draw information out, and a story would be helpful in doing that. And what I like to call a Holy Spirit moment, an image went off in my head like a bomb. And it was this. Now, it doesn't look that enticing, but what I said to this girl was, similar to one of my previous conversations, what you just said is very interesting. And I said, it reminds me of a picture my friend posted on Facebook. And I didn't have it on me, and so I began to describe what you're looking at. And I said to the girl, my friend posted a picture of a river. And in the middle of the river was something slightly curvy sticking out, but you couldn't really tell what it was. It was the kind of picture you really wouldn't pay attention to if it hadn't been for the caption my friend put with it. And the caption to that picture was this: "My husband is a hero." Now this girl's drawn in by that little bit of story so far because she's wondering why. And so I said, underneath the caption, my friend described why. And I said, my friend wrote, "My husband is a paramedic. And at midnight, he was called to the scene of a car accident. A woman had been driving down the road, lost control of her vehicle, and as it spun around several times, it landed in a nearby river. When my friend's husband got to the scene of the accident, he saw that the woman who had been driving the vehicle was sitting on the roof of her sinking car, holding her 10-month-old baby in her arms. My friend's husband jumped in the water, swam towards the river, and swam towards the car, and realized he could only take one person at a time to shore. Having told the story, I ended with a question. I looked at the student and I said, "Who do you think he took first?" And she said, "Well, the baby." I said, "Yeah, why?" Then she looked at me like I was crazy. I knew she knew the answer why. I knew the answer why. But I knew there was power in her verbalizing it. There was power in her articulating the reasoning because it was something I was going to eventually bring back to our original discussion. And so I said, "No, I know the reason. I'm asking you because I'm just curious. If you had to explain to someone why he was right to pick the baby first, what would your reasoning be?" She goes, "Well, obviously, you picked the mom first. By the time he got back to the car, the baby could have rolled in the water and drowned." I said, "Exactly. So you think he made the right choice?" She said, "Of course." And I said, "You know what? I agree with you." And I said, "Here's what I think this says about how you and I think." I said, "What I think this says about us is we recognize when we have a stronger person in one hand, like the mom, and a weaker person in the other hand, like the baby, that we realize, you and me, that we should put weaker people ahead of stronger people." She said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay, let's take that back to our original conversation." I said, "You talked about babies versus fetuses, and you said we should obviously pick babies." And then I said to her what I said to you. I said, anyone could take care of a baby, and at times a baby can be left alone. But a fetus can only be cared for one person and must always be with that individual. And since you believe that we should put weaker people ahead of stronger people, and since the fetus is weaker than the baby who's stronger, shouldn't we prioritize the needs of fetuses? She looked at me, stepping back, and she said, "You argue really good." Now you'll notice, though, that what I was doing was drawing a truth out of her that was already written in her, that we ought to be selfless, that we ought to look outward, not inward, that we ought to care for the weak and vulnerable. The importance of caring for the weak and vulnerable, the importance of highlighting the vulnerability of the preborn child as highlighting our responsibility for the preborn child, was a point that I demonstrated through another story to an audience I was once dialoguing with that was very, very hostile towards me. I was on another college campus, and I was at a pro-life exhibit that was comparing abortion to historical injustices like the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide. And the point of the exhibit was to say, just as it was wrong in the past to take a certain group of humans and deprive them of personhood status based on an irrelevant feature like ethnicity or skin color or religion, so too is it wrong in the present to deprive a certain group of humans their personhood status, preborn children, based on an irrelevant feature such as their age. But when you bring a shocking exhibit, as this exhibit was, to a college campus, you can get quite a reaction from students. And as I was talking to this crowd, at one point there was a group of protesters that were chanting and they were yelling and they were calling out and they were saying, "This is offensive! This is offensive! How dare you compare abortion to real human rights violations? How dare you compare abortion to the Holocaust? How dare you compare abortion to the Rwandan genocide?" And so I walked over to one of the pictures in particular, which was this one comparing abortion to the Rwandan genocide. And I said, "Your objection is fair." And I said, "I wondered it once myself. And if you'll bear with me, I want to tell you a story about a different time I was standing with this very sign, where a woman from Rwanda walked past." And so the students are now listening. And I told the students that a couple years prior to meeting them, I was back in Canada, holding a sign much like this, except it said "Butcher Children in Canada" instead of America. And I said I was standing with this sign near an abortion clinic, and I was handing out literature to passers-by. And a woman came up, and I offered her a pamphlet, and she took it, and she got talking with me, and she told me she was from Rwanda. And she told me that most of her family was killed in the genocide. And she told me that she was only standing before me because she managed to flee the country before things got really bad. And I said to these students, I became very self-conscious standing with this sign in front of this woman. Because like you, I wondered if maybe this was offensive, if maybe I was doing something wrong. And so I said to them, at this point you're listening, I said to them, instead of making an assumption, I decided to ask her a question. And I said, "How do you feel about the message on this picture?" And the woman stepped back to really take it all in, and she went silent for about 20 seconds. And after that period of silence, she pointed to the picture of the aborted baby, and she said, "That's worse. Because at least my family could try to run away." And you could have heard a pin drop amongst that previously hostile crowd. What that woman recognized is the greater a victim's vulnerability, the greater our responsibility, and the more horrifying the attack, because they're incapable of defending themselves. To give you another example of the power of questions and stories, on another college campus, a student came to the microphone and said to me, "My stepmom had an abortion because she was told her baby was going to die at birth. Are you telling me she was wrong?" And so I looked at him and I said, "Well, first of all, I want to express my sympathy for what your stepmom went through." I said, "I don't pretend to know what that's like. And I can only imagine the suffering that involved." And I said, "What makes me sad for people like your stepmom is all too often there are some in the medical community who will lead people like your stepmom to believe that abortion is the answer." And I said, "Your question is a fair one. I'm going to answer your question, but if you'll bear with me, I think I can best answer your question by asking you some questions, engaging you in a back and forth dialogue. Would you be okay with that?" Of course, we had a crowd listening. I wanted his permission to kind of engage him that way. He said, he could tell I was calm and I was reasonable. He said, "Sure." And I said, "Okay." I said, starting with the story, I said, "I want you to imagine something for a moment, a little thought experiment." I said, "Imagine that you have a loved one on the opposite end of the country. We were in Florida. I said, maybe you know someone in Los Angeles, and they call you today and they say, I've just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I said, imagine they say to you, I've only got a month left to live. So I looked at the student and I said, would you wait until week 3, day 6 to hop on a plane and say goodbye to this person you love? Or would you take the next flight out and savor every moment of every day of the next 4 weeks with the person you love? And he said, the second option. I said, me too. And I said, here's what I think this says about us. What I think it says about us is we recognize when we have a minimal amount of time left with someone we love, we want to maximize the minimal time we have. We don't want to cut short the already short time we have. So I said, let's take that principle and now apply it to the situation your stepmom found herself in. Before that poor prenatal diagnosis, she probably thought she had 50 years with her child. And in that one moment where she was told her baby was going to die at birth, probably 20 weeks away from when that diagnosis happened, she went from having 50 years to 20 weeks. I said, based on your answer to that little thought experiment, why would we cut short the already short time we have left and have an abortion? Wouldn't we want to savor every moment of every day of the next 20 weeks with the child that we love? Now, would there be grief and sadness when that baby dies at birth? Yes. But consider this, would there be grief and sadness when that baby dies at abortion? Yes. So we're not eliminating the grief and sadness. The first Christmas comes along, the memories will come back. The first birthday, should have been birthday, the memories will come back. So the abortion is not going to take away any of the sadness and sorrow, but it is going to take away the precious gift of time. That story demonstrates the power of perspective. When it comes to poor prenatal diagnosis, it's not always one where the child will die at birth, but perhaps one where the child will have a life of disability. And what we need to do is come up with ways that we can help change people's perspective. And I want to play for you a short video clip that really is a story, in a sense, that we can share with the culture of how we can change our perspective when it comes to poor prenatal diagnosis. So if we could have the lights down, let's take a look. It's not what you're treating, it's who you're treating. The power of perspective. And we can use Rick Guidotti's story and his positive exposure project to help change people's attitudes in these circumstances. The last example I want to give you of helping to sharpen our minds before ending with softening our hearts is perhaps one of the most challenging situations I found myself in. I'm sometimes asked, what is the toughest question you were asked? And before I give you the exact tough question, I will tell you about one of the tougher questions in general abortion supporters will raise. And that is a bodily rights argument. And there is an abortion supporter who in the 1960s came up with an analogy to argue that abortion could be justified even if embryos and fetuses are human persons just like you and me. And the analogy she came up with is this. She said, imagine you wake up one day and you're in a hospital. You don't know how you got there. All you know is that you turn around and you're in a hospital bed with a stranger who's plugged into you. A doctor walks into the room and says, I'm terribly sorry for the situation you find yourself in, but you see, last night you were kidnapped by the Society for Music Lovers because there's this world-famous violinist, the man you're in bed with, he was going to die. And the Society for Music Lovers didn't want him to die, and they knew that you were the only person in the entire world who could keep him alive. And so they kidnapped you to plug him into you so he wouldn't die. I realize it's an inconvenience, but don't worry, it's not forever. He's just plugged in for 9 months. And so she brings up this analogy to say, this violinist is a human person like you or me, but he doesn't have a right to use your body against your will. So just as you can reach around and unplug him, so too can a woman unplug her fetus. And so I want to take you through what the typical pro-life responses are. The first pro-life response is to say, wait a minute, that's not really parallel, because abortion isn't merely unplugging. It's more violent than that. So the question is, do you have a right to reach around, grab a machete, and chop the violinist up? And if you wouldn't be allowed to do that, then you shouldn't be allowed to do an abortion. But here's the weakness in that response. The abortion supporter will just change the abortion procedure and say, yeah, fair enough, let's make it less violent. Let's merely, truly unplug the embryo, remove the embryo the way we would unplug and remove the violinist. Would you be okay then? And then we wouldn't. So then the next typical pro-life response is to say, well, wait a minute, when you consent to actions, you have to accept the consequences. And you didn't consent to being kidnapped. That's very different. The vast majority of pregnancies come about because a woman consented to sex, so she has to accept the consequences of her actions. I think we all know the weakness here. Then the abortion supporter will say, well, are you okay with abortion in cases of rape where the woman didn't consent? And no, we're not going to be okay. So then that leads us to the next typical pro-life response, which is to say, well, wait a minute, parents have a responsibility to their offspring that they don't have to strangers. And so the man in bed with you is a stranger, and you don't have a responsibility to him the way if someone's starving in your city, you're not going to be arrested for not feeding them. But parents, however, have a responsibility to their offspring. And just as you'll be arrested for not feeding and clothing and sheltering your child, your vulnerable infant, let's say, then so too could we argue that the pregnant woman, even a rape victim, by virtue of being the parent, has a responsibility to her child. And that brings me to the moment I was almost stumped. I was at a university campus in Canada debating a philosophy professor, and he took the idea of that analogy that I just presented to you, but he created a parent-child relationship, and he changed it slightly. And so he got up in front of 200 college students and he said, I'm going to argue tonight that the embryo, from the moment of fertilization, is a human person just like all of us, but I'm going to argue that abortion can be justified on the grounds that the human person, even a child, does not have a right to use another human person's body. He said, let me give you an example. Imagine you have a child, and your child is dying of kidney disease, and your child needs a kidney transplant. And imagine that you're the only person with the right body type to be able to give a kidney to save your child's life. Would it kill you to donate one of your kidneys to your child? No, it would not, he said. Would it save your child? Yes, it would, he said. Would it be nice to do it? Absolutely. But, he said, should the law force a parent to give their kidney to their child? No, it should not. And just as the law should not force a parent to give their kidney to their child, the law should not force the parent to give her uterus to her child. So I'm sitting there in the audience, right in front of everyone, taking notes, looking calm, cool, and collected on the outside, dying on the inside, thinking, I wasn't prepared for this. He changed the analogy. It's not a violinist. And so I did the first tip that I gave you, which was prayer. And so I'm writing to the audience, it looks like anyways that I'm writing, but I'm praying. And inside I'm saying, Holy Spirit, help me. I don't know what to say. And so as I'm praying and kind of writing thoughts and feeling lost, I sensed God speak to me. Now I have to admit, it wasn't the audible voice of God, but I sensed very clearly that he said exactly this. Stephanie, I made the uterus for a different purpose. So I began to think about that over and over and over, and taking my notes. Okay. And then I got up and I said, Dr. Snedden makes a very, very compelling argument. Pause for effect. Until we ask ourselves a question. And I said, the question we have to ask ourselves is this. What is the nature and purpose of the kidney versus the nature and purpose of the uterus? Because when we ask ourselves those questions, we come to see why a parent isn't legally obligated to give their kidney, but is or ought to be legally obligated to give their child their uterus. I said, the kidney exists in my body for my body. But I said, the uterus is very, very different. I said, the uterus exists in my body every single month, getting ready for someone else's body. I said, I can live without my uterus, but my offspring cannot. It is an organ unlike all the others, which exists more for the next generation than it exists for the very individual whose body it's in. And I said, that is why a parent is obligated to give their uterus, but not obligated to give their kidney. Well, several days later, a student reported back to me who attends his class that he told his class that he was up all night trying to think of a response. So that emphasizes the importance of prayer. That ultimately all our ideas have to come from being attached to the vine. Which leads me to my third and final part that I wanted to address in my talk tonight, which is the importance of, after prayer and sharpening our minds, how critical it is that we soften our hearts. A couple years ago, I was on another college campus, and after giving a talk, a philosophy student comes up to me and has a lot of interesting analogies, very intellectual approach that he wants to take, and we're going round and round and round in our conversation. I seem to be getting nowhere with him, and he had created a definition of personhood which excluded preborn children. And so at one point in the conversation, I said to him, you know, in my world, you're safe. Because in my world, by being a member of the human family, that's all that's needed for you to be considered a person. But I said, in your world, you could be a victim of your philosophy. Because in your world, you're creating a definition of person that involves being human plus a bunch of criteria that suits you right now because it includes you, but it's entirely arbitrary. And I said, someone else could come along in your world, do the same thing as you, pick a bunch of arbitrary criteria, and if they're more powerful than you, the way you're more powerful than the embryo, they could come up with a definition of person that excludes you, and you'll have no argument. I said, in my world, you're safe. And he looked at me with fire in his eyes, and he said, in your world, I wouldn't exist. I had no idea what he was talking about. But I remembered the importance of questions. And so I looked at him and I said, what do you mean? And he said, my mother had an abortion. She had an abortion shortly before she got pregnant with me. If she'd never have had that abortion, she never would have conceived me. And in that moment, it was like the scales fell from my eyes. And I thought, this guy is not trying to rationalize slaughtering babies. He's trying to rationalize his very existence. He has to live with the painful reality that there is no chance that the one sperm to hit the one egg to make him never would have come together if his sibling had not been silently slaughtered. That is a very painful reality to come to terms with. And in that moment, I realized all his intellectual arguments were a coping mechanism for the pain here. And that I had been feeding it by staying there. But the real problem wasn't an intellectual one. It was an emotional one. It was a heart one. And so I started to change the direction of the conversation. And I said, how is your mom doing? I said, do you ever think about that sibling? There's an interesting little thought experiment given in a book called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, where the author has the reader imagine 3 buckets of water in front of them. One has cold water, the middle one has lukewarm water, the other one has hot water. And the author says, imagine you put your right hand in the hot water and your left hand in the cold water. And then you take them both out and put them in the middle bucket. He said the hand which came from the cold water is going to think the new bucket of water is what? Hot. The hand which came from the hot water is going to think the new bucket of water is cold. Both of them actually are objectively wrong. The new bucket of water is lukewarm. But the previous experience is coloring the present interpretation. And that's what I realized when I was dialoguing with this student.
that where he was coming from was influencing everything about what I was saying and what he was hearing and whether or not he could receive it. And it's so important in those moments that through prayer we have the wisdom to know what strategy to take. And that strategy might mean abandoning all of our arguments and all of our intellectual strategies to just meet that person where they're at. To give you another example, I gave a talk and a student got up and said, well, what about rape? And I took a very intellectual approach and I said, certainly that's an injustice and we need more serious consequences for the people who are committing that kind of vile crime. We need compassion for victims of sexual assault. And I said, but I have to ask myself a question. Is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? And she said, yeah, but, and she made another point. And so I said, okay, I thought to myself, well, come on with a stronger answer. And I said, imagine this. I said, imagine you have someone who has consensual sex on Monday, and on Tuesday they're raped by a stranger. So in a month's time, when they discover they're pregnant, they don't know if the father of the child is the husband or the rapist. So I said, imagine the woman carries through with the pregnancy, hoping it's her husband's child, and then when the baby is born, they run a paternity test. Now imagine at that point, the results when they come back reveal the child's father is the rapist. Would we be allowed to kill the newborn child because of the father's crime? If not, why would we be allowed to kill the preborn child because of the father's crime? And she said, yeah, but, and that wouldn't happen anyways, and that's not likely. So I thought, okay, well, I got something else for you. And I said, well, there was a New York Times article that interviewed an abortionist, Dr. Wickland. And in this article, it said Dr. Wickland described her horror when she aborted the pregnancy of a woman who had been raped, only to discover, after examining the removed tissue to make sure she got all the body parts out, after examining the removed tissue, she discovered the pregnancy was further along than she and the woman had thought. And in that moment, she realized she had just aborted an embryo the woman and her husband had conceived together. And I looked at the student, I said, so that actually did happen, and this abortionist was horrified. She said, yeah, but, and I said, I would be happy to keep talking with you, but out of fairness to all the other audience members, I need to give them a chance to ask questions. So I'd just like to encourage you to come speak with me one-on-one afterwards. I'd be happy to dialogue, but I have to take someone else's questions. So she sat down, I take other questions, the presentation is done, boom, she's right at my podium, she wants to speak with me. And so she again brings up pregnancy and cases of rape, and I started to wonder if maybe I could be speaking to someone who was a victim of sexual assault. Or maybe she knew someone who was. And maybe her laser beam focus was coming from that experience. And so I looked at her and I said, I have a friend who was molested as a child, and I said, I'm one of about 5 people who know this. She's never even told her parents. And I said, I'll be honest with you, my friend never got pregnant, she was too young. But I said, journeying with her to get help and healing showed me that whether someone gets pregnant or not, they've been traumatized. And if they get pregnant and have an abortion, that's not going to take the trauma away of the act of sexual assault. And then her whole demeanor changed. And she looked at me and she said, yeah, 10 years and counting. And I looked at her and I said, I am so sorry for your suffering. And she said, well, I'm sorry for your friend. And again, like with the other students, scales fell from my eyes, and I thought, this girl is coming from a place of pain. And I set aside all my arguments and my winning analogies, and I said, are you safe? Is the person who hurt you still in your life? And I asked more questions about whether she had counseling and whether there was anything I could do to connect her to local support. And by the end of the conversation, that girl had changed before my eyes. And when I say changed, I don't know when she left if she rejects abortion in cases of rape. I hope she does. Because we really can't blame the baby for the father's crime. But all I know is that there was something lighter in her spirit. That by the end of our encounter, she realized, even if it hadn't been obvious at the beginning when I was talking to the crowd, that I was really concerned for her. And in that moment, I was reminded of something my friends over at a pro-life group called Justice for All have said. When someone asks about rape, they're not asking if the baby is human. They're asking if the pro-lifer is human. Do we care? Are we as concerned for the victim of sexual assault as we're concerned for the preborn child who came about as a result? And so I share these stories to emphasize the importance of being flexible in our encounters and open to the Holy Spirit. And when someone is really focused, to ask open-ended questions like, do you know anyone who's had an abortion? Or, when did you first learn about abortion and what was your opinion then? Oh, it changed. Oh, when did it change? Oh, what compelled that change? Do you know anyone who suffered a lot if they're focused on suffering? And it's those kinds of open-ended questions that might direct the conversation from the head to the heart, where they're going to reveal their story. And it gives us an opportunity to seek to understand where they're coming from and love them in that moment so that they will eventually be able to love the preborn child. And so the story I'd like to leave you with that I think wraps all this up is a story that was told to me by a physician who, back in Canada, contacted me a couple years ago. And she told me that she had a patient who was almost 20 weeks along in her pregnancy. And this patient had gone to get an ultrasound and found out that she was pregnant with a female fetus. And the patient had come back to the doctor saying she wanted an abortion because she did not want a girl. And so the doctor called me to get advice on what to do and what to say. And she wanted to know two things. One, did she have a right to avoid all involvement with the abortion? And two, how could she try to change her patient's mind? And so in the first case, I affirmed, yes, she in no way had to be involved with this abortion. She did not have to refer for it, did not have to facilitate it in any way. But I encouraged her in her second concern. I said, but what really is important here is not merely that you wash your hands of the situation to make sure you don't do anything bad, but what's important is that you try to actively do something good and try to change this patient's mind. And I'm encouraged that you want to do that. And so we started to brainstorm about things she could do, information about abortion she could share, questions she could ask. I connected her to a Mandarin-speaking physician I knew in the city that she was in. And they met and they strategized, and I sent her resources, and she had a follow-up appointment scheduled with this patient a couple days later. And as a physician who was a Catholic, she prayed the night before meeting with this patient. And as she was praying, she really sensed the Holy Spirit say to her, let this woman know how much I love her. I was kind of playing over and over in her mind. And so the next day after she had prayed, at the end of the day, she had scheduled the appointment with the patient and the patient's husband so she could give them as much time as needed as they would be her last patients of the day. And she went in armed with all the resources and armed with all the material and remembering, let her know how much I love her. And so the strategy she took was to seek to understand why the patient wanted the abortion. No, all too often we just think, well, that's horrible. It's wrong. Or, well, there's how you go get it. But instead, this doctor was like, I'm curious, why do you want this? And the patient opened up and revealed something to her doctor she had never told her before. And she explained that she was raised in a home where she was taught that her life was meaningless because she was a girl. She was routinely locked in a tiny closet in the family home. And she was deprived of food and of water and of the restroom. And then when it got really cold outside, her family would take her out of the closet and force her outdoors and shut the door. And in that moment, the doctor thought, this woman doesn't want to kill a girl. She wants to spare a girl the kind of suffering that she lived through. Now, she was wrong that abortion was the answer to that, but because of her emotional fragile state, because of what bucket of water she was in before that encounter, it started to explain everything. And so the doctor listened, And then the doctor gently pointed out things like, you don't have to do what your parents did to you. And the patient ended up conveying that she felt the doctor was the first person she'd ever met who truly and authentically cared about her. Several months later, at Easter time, a baby girl was born. All because that doctor sought to understand, to set aside any agenda and meet the patient where she was at and listen and let the Holy Spirit work with that. And so that's ultimately what I want to leave you with. The idea that wherever you find yourself encountering someone, maybe in conversation with family, a colleague at work, a stranger on the bus, that you remember to begin with prayer and to have that sharp mind that is ready to ask good questions and make strong analogies and stories, but to never forget the importance of having that tender and soft heart that can meet that person where they're at. And if we do that, then we will live the words of Dr. King, whom you would change, you must first love, and they must know that you love them. Thank you very much.